All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We are live on January 19th, 2023. Please keep in mind that today's session is being recorded for future watching abilities, if you will. And for those not so familiar with my voice, my name is Crystal Cedino, and I am the Training and Development Manager for the Native Learning Center. Really thrilled that all of you could be here today, so thank you very much. Today's webinar topic is Site Planning and Readiness to Proceed Housing and Community Development Projects, presented by Adam Rose. He is the Director of Partnerships and Growth for Travoy. All right, just a quick disclaimer. This webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes, and the material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. So please keep that in mind as we move through today's session. And what I would like to do now is familiarize you with some of the features available and how the environment works. So if you take a gander at the top of your screen, you should see an icon in the shape of a hand. And with that icon, you can either raise your hand, agree, disagree, or step away. There's also applaud, laugh, speak louder, softer, and so on and so forth. So please feel free to utilize those features as they are there for you to make today's session as interactive as possible. All right, now the image displayed here should look pretty similar to the layout of your screen. With that, I'm going to start off to the bottom left. And in the bottom left, there's going to be a box that's labeled Files. And in there, you can find a PDF copy of today's presentation. Feel free to download that. All you have to do is hover over that item, and you should see an arrow pointing downward, which allows you to download that actual file, depending on your computer's allowabilities and so on. With that, feel free to take that and use it for reference material either during or after today's webinar. All right, next is to the right, a box that says web links. In there, you're going to find a link to today's survey, which I will launch when the time comes. There is also a link for the Adobe Connect desktop download. We do see quite a few participants in the room utilizing the web browser feature, which is totally okay, but we do notice less connectivity issues if you actually download the application. We do not get any kickbacks or anything like that. We just recommend for a better viewing and listening experience to do that. So if you have a moment, go ahead and do that. I can also plug that into the chat box. Which, speaking of, is the last box in which all participants are going to be communicating. There's no microphone access for participants, so please keep that in mind. If you do have any questions or concerns, feel free to type them in the chat box. All you have to do is type your message and hit enter or that up arrow icon to submit. We really do encourage class participation, questions, all of the great things. These webinars are only as efficient as you utilize them to be. So if you have questions, throw them in there. And if you have any IT concerns or anything like that as well, throw that into the chat box and I will do my best to resolve those issues. All right, that is pretty much it for the layout of Adobe Connect. I'm going to go ahead and let Adam introduce himself. And we also have a guest speaker, Bruce Shimizu. I hope I said that correctly, but Adam is the Director of Partnerships and Growth for Travoy. And go ahead and Adam, take it on over.
Crystal, thanks so much for the introduction. I'm not going to read my whole bio or anything today. I'm really thrilled to be here again today, and really, more importantly, thrilled to have my guest Bruce joining us in his expertise. I love the opportunity to talk about tribal projects and the great work that tribes are doing every single day. Bruce is integrally involved in that work at his work at LACO. And we really appreciate the opportunity and the Native Learning Center's opportunity to pass on more information about this project, but also really just to start thinking about site planning and what tribes can do on the ground, kind of at a practical day-to-day level, to really move projects forward. I think that that's certainly the goal of both what Bruce and I are thinking about as part of this conversation. So again, we really encourage participants, reach out in the chat. Bruce is an absolute expert on this on the civil side. So hopefully between him and myself and the project that we're going to look at today, we can provide the participants with some really practical, implementable, short-term and cost-effective strategies to really get something off the ground in the short term. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and um, Bruce, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself quick. And I know in just a minute, I'm going to let you talk about LACO more specifically, but can you just tell everyone who you are and your role there at LACO?
Sure. I'm a senior project manager and also what we're considering our housing specialist. I've been doing real estate development, particularly affordable housing, for the last 35 years in Northern California and Hawaii. I've worked for a number of nonprofit organizations, um, n- um, including some of the regional nonprofits in Northern California, Habitat for Humanity, and et cetera. So, and in addition, I had my own small development company. So I was glad when Adam asked me if I would join in on this. I've done it once or twice before with Travoy, and I found it really interesting to field the questions from the different tribal members with the issues and concerns they have with doing development projects. So, you know, I'm not one of the I'm not one of those people that say there isn't a stupid question. There may be inappropriate ones, but all good questions are good, and it doesn't matter how much experience you have. Um, if you need to know something, you need to know it. So
Yeah,
we want to be able to do
absolutely.
whatever we can.
And I think just to reiterate on that, Bruce, again, this is a learning opportunity. There's lots of participants that are all dealing with different challenges with their particular projects. So again, use this as a resource and use Bruce, myself, and the other participants, and maybe we can all walk away and learn something in the process. Just a little bit more about Travoy and our work. So our work really started around helping tribes leverage and access two particular funding resources. One of those is a resource called low-income housing tax credits. I think we're actually helping with a webinar next week through the Native Learning Centers platform next Thursday. So I do encourage you to check that one out specifically for information on how that resource works, how it gets into projects, and how it can ultimately help pay for 60, 70, 80% of a project's cost with funds that don't have to be paid back. The other resource that we help with is a resource called New Markets Tax Credits. So totally separate, but in that case, that's a resource that can cover 20 to 30% of a project's cost for things like tribal admin facilities, clinics, specialty care clinics, treatment facilities, schools, broadband infrastructure, um, water and sewer, wastewater infrastructure, you name it. That resource on the economic development side is absolutely a viable tool to help in that regard. We've helped in this capacity on over 200 projects, which is helped raise over 893 million, the portion of investment into Native communities that doesn't have to be paid back. So, again, we're so excited and thrilled to have played this role since 1995, a small role alongside the critical work that our partners are playing on the ground to make these projects happen. But that's helped rehab or rehabilitate or build new about 6,000 homes across Indian country. We help with a number of other smaller programs that can help. The affordable housing program is one of those, capital magnet fund. So those programs alongside NAHASDA, competitive IHBG, Title VI secured loans, all certainly very, very viable sources to get a big project, say 15, $20 million, maybe to build 25 or 30 homes for your community off the ground. With that, Bruce, do you want to go ahead and talk a little bit more about LACO and if there's anything else that you want to talk about in your work there and kind of your background?
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, LACO Associates, we're a civil engineering planning firm. We also provide geotechnical, hydrogeology, and grant writing. We're doing a lot more of that with tribal communities. So if you have needs for, to raise, whether it's local, state, or federal funds, we have experienced grant writers doing that. And then we have an office, as you see on the screen, we have an office in Eureka, Ukiah, Santa Rosa, and then we opened an office in Chico. So we're spread across Northern California, but we do work in Indian country all across the state, and we're talking to a couple of tribes, one in Oregon and one in Arizona. So we are a member-owned firm, so we're able to work on tribal lands across the country. We're able to do survey work, planning work, and we have our engineers getting certified to be, or surveyors getting certified to be able to do surveys across the country as well on tribal lands. So we're kind of excited. We just started using unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, to do lidar surveys and other aerial photogrammetry. So that's come in really handy with some of our more remote tribal communities where it's hard to get survey ground crews in. We can fly over them. And for those of you that haven't participated or seen a lidar webinar or know anything about lidar, it's a fantastic technology, especially for or areas that have a lot of tree cover and it's hard to know what the ground looks like. It's an excellent technology. So we're glad to be providing that service to our members as well.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce, for that. You know, the technology evolution, especially how you guys are using it there at LACO, has been pretty awesome to see, and just, you know, what the resource is and how it can really benefit a tribal project that's trying to move something forward. We're going to go ahead and kind of jump right into this, but again, what I want to stress today, that our intent, both Bruce and I's intent, is with this discussion is really helping, you know, maybe you're a project manager at your tribe, maybe you're the development director, maybe you're the executive director, and you're kind of the one-man show that's moving everything forward. We want to really talk about tangible things that you can do in the short term. You know, maybe there's discussion at the council level, and that discussion is, hey, you know, we really need elder housing in our community. Maybe there's a couple sites that have been talked about as far as preliminary discussion, but, you know, it's now in your court, or you as a individual project manager, to kind of take that to the next level. So I think the intent here is, you know, a project at that stage, how do we start thinking about that project? What are the really key on the ground things, checklist of items that absolutely should be on your radar? And then how can you supplement those types of things with professional expertise, with someone like Bruce joining the team at the appropriate time to really take advantage and make sure that your project is moving in the right direction? Again, I think that a lot of this is due diligence related to risk mitigation. And so, Bruce, I want to just start with kind of that high level generic question. Risk mitigation, that's sort of what we're talking about when it comes to all these different topics that we're going to go through today. But when we start talking about a project, it's really, I think it's sort of it's like, how do we identify the risks in the planning process? How do we know that they're there during construction? And then how do we mitigate them in the planning process to ensure that they don't become a barrier to the project or a cost barrier to the project? Is that sort of a fair way that you're sort of starting to think about projects?
Absolutely. The longer or the more experience you have in developing, whether it's housing or community facilities, um, whether you're developing on tribal lands, trust lands, or whether you're looking to acquire fee land to be able to do housing, or a C store or something, um, it's hard to overcome the the need to spend upfront money to do studies and reports to see if a site is suitable for what you want to do. But I've seen too many clients make the mistake of moving forward with a project without doing adequate due diligence. And I always tell them, the few tens of thousands of dollars that you spend upfront to do a phase one environmental site assessment to see if there's any hazardous materials, or if the site had previously been used for a purpose that could create problems, um, biological, whether it's plants or animal species that may be protected, um, and any number of other special studies. Those tens of thousands of dollars can save you an inordinate amount of time.
Yeah.
In California, for example, if you if you have some rare or endangered plant, you can only study them within a certain time of year, and if you miss that narrow window, you have to wait another year to do that. So being able to bring on a team of consultants early on to do that work for you can save you a lot of money in the long run. And there are any number of excellent guides that can help you identify what are the major risks involved in doing development, like the project site that we're looking at in Cloverdale for the Dry Creek Rancheria. It's a wooded hillside with oaks and grasslands, and it had previously been used as a farm. So we wanted to make sure that there were no agricultural pesticides that were used on the site. It's got a hillside. We wanted to make sure that the geology is stable. So a geotechnical report and soils report were done on that. We're also in a high wildfire danger area. If you guys watched the national news, California had a series of wildfires over the past 5 years. None of them reached this particular site, but they were just across the valley. So those things affect your ability to get insurance later on.
Yep.
We're also in close proximity to Highway 101, which is a major north-south arterial in California. If you're planning on doing a rental development close to a freeway, you have to pay attention to sound and air quality. There's a lot of filtration and other measures that you need to take if you're using a tax credit program or some HUD programs to make sure you have good air quality for the residents, both inside and outside of the units.
Yep.
So,
And so that's a great start to this whole conversation that we're going to have, and kind of use this example at the Dry Creek Rancheria to really kind of dive into this more, and how Bruce and the team kind of started to apply some of those lessons on the very things that he's talking about. I think that we do have a question to start. So, Crystal, can you go ahead and read that question?
Sure thing. So Josh Demet inquired, instead of building houses with this funding, can it just build an apartment complex?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the resource there that the participant may be asking about, again, I would defer to the resource called Low Income Housing Tax Credits. We're not going to spend a ton of time talking about that specific resource today. I will say that this project at Dry Creek absolutely utilized that resource to get this project off the ground, but we're not going to talk about specifics of how it works or how it gets into projects. But it's absolutely a resource that can be used for single family projects. It can be used for multifamily projects. You can rehab existing current assisted stock units with that resource. You can even do a combination project where maybe you're rehabbing some buildings on one part of the parcel, and then maybe there's room to build a few more. Also absolutely permissible with the housing tax credit program. Now, again, I'm not going to talk about specifics, but I think one caveat to that program I think is worth noting right off the top. So when we're talking about housing tax credits, it very viably can cover 60, 70, 80% of a project's cost, depending on the project type and the level of infrastructure required and that type of thing. However, I encourage groups to understand going in, kind of think about the population that you're trying to serve, because with that program, 100% of the units will be rented to families at or below 60% area median income. So slightly deeper income targeting compared to, say, NAHASDA. Now, if you do have a population, maybe it's elders, maybe it's family, and you say, hey, we have no problem at all. We have 200 families on our waiting list. We can easily fill 30, 35 units. Then absolutely that tax credit resource is a good one. We've had lots of conversations recently about the need for middle income housing in tribal communities. I would say that that funding source is still challenging. I mean, there's not a great one where that's ideal to benefit those populations, maybe in the 80 to 120 AMI range. Oftentimes, they're not really eligible for a lot of other sources of funding, but we certainly recognize that that's a huge need in tribal housing, kind of that middle income bracket. But again, housing tax credits can certainly be viable if you're willing to look at that 60% area median income level or below. Bruce, you started to touch on this site, but maybe we can just zoom out a little bit further, and maybe you can talk about just where this is This is Sonoma County, California. So kind of heart of wine country. Obviously, this is, as you would probably expect, probably the highest construction cost per square foot that we've certainly seen recently, but like probably across the country, one of the very, very high areas for housing construction. So can you just talk about what this community looks like kind of in general and where it's at related to, this is the town of Cloverdale, but start to give some context of where the city boundary was and how that played in ultimately to this big annexation discussion that we're going to have?
Sure, Adam. Cloverdale is about an hour and a half north of San Francisco, as Adam mentioned, in the Sonoma County wine country. If you see that the road, Kelly Road, um, there's a parcel above Kelly Road, and then you see the dashed line for the art project site from just north of Kelly Road all the way down to where you see the word project site. There's a number. There's 5 parcels that were part of South Cloverdale that are not. They're in the county of Sonoma, and in order to be able to utilize public services, we needed to annex the property. And this was something that the city has been wanting to do for over 20 years. But you really need the property owners to agree to take on that responsibility. And when Dry Creek Rancheria, a band of Pomo Indians, decided to buy this site for housing, um, that was the major impetus that got the ball rolling. In
Yep.
addition to the housing site, they also own the property between the project site and South Cloverdale Boulevard. And at some point in the not too distant future, they want to develop some commercial and light industrial on there, maybe a hotel and some mini storage or something as
Yep.
an economic development engine.
Right.
So
So this is
by
fee land, right, Bruce, to
it's
start
all
with?
fee land. Yeah, and that
And
this
so
was
it was part of the county. It was not part of the city's jurisdiction um, up until the time that it was annexed. When the Rancheria bought it, it was part of the county. And so, can you talk about like ultimately a huge factor that drove annexation was the end goal of connecting into the city's infrastructure system, correct?
right. We need to be able to get sewer and water to the site, and right now the existing that's the project site and the surrounding properties are served by a small municipal or a small private water system that had reached its capacity. And to be able to do a number of units and a potential hotel, they really needed to tie into the city of Cloverdale's water system and wastewater treatment facility. So part of the project is to loop water mains from the city and then to develop a sewer system, and which requires a pumping station to take effluent from the southern part of Cloverdale and pump it to the city's wastewater treatment facility, which was key for the development of this site and all the other surrounding properties.
Yep, absolutely.
This
So,
is a
do
oh,
you
go
want to
ahead.
go ahead and just talk about? I know that I can certainly talk about it too, but you want to introduce kind of what the concept here was and what they were thinking about. This is ultimately the final layout of including both the community building that's part of the project as well as the detached units that are part of the project. Um, how did this kind of come about from your understanding?
Yeah, one of the desires of the tribe was to not have, because of the rural character of this site, and they knew that they didn't need, a 75 unit um, apartment here, and they wanted to kind of look at the rural character and have housing units that kind of match the surroundings. So they opted for small detached homes, which, you know per unit they're more expensive because you have more siding, more roof, etc.
Yep.
But the character of it, as a senior development for the elders in the community, that was important. They wanted them to have, place where they could have their family and friends over. And then in the heart of it is a community center where they could have classes and have community gatherings. So there's a kitchen, an exercise room, a large multi-purpose area, And then outside of the community center, there's an area for a fire circle, community garden, some recreational opportunities, because many of the households are multi-generational. There's a lot of grandparents taking care of their grandchildren, et cetera. So they wanted to make sure that this was a multi-generational facility and can have space for activities for seniors and younger children as well. So
Yep.
there's a lot of walking trails, because that's a valuable, important thing, and in areas to be able to grow reeds to make baskets for cultural education. And then that, because it is nestled in a hillside with oaks around it, they want to make sure that the development fit, so that when you look at it, it doesn't look like a scarred piece of the landscape. So when we were grading the site, we adjusted it so that it not only is accessible walking, so it meets ADA standards for walking throughout the entire site, but that the units are stepped so that they're not all at one level, and they build into the hillside, and that was quite a challenge.
Yeah. And so this next map, I know it's not super evident for everyone. Hopefully, hopefully it's evident, but might be less understandable for some people on the call about what these little tiny lines mean and what the elevation is. But I think it kind of creates a very clear picture once you have an understanding of it, of what the topography and how that impacts this particular site. Can you talk about, Bruce, just how topography kind of played into the site layout, and then kind of what we're looking at here, down here, where it kind of flattens out versus these little tiny lines, and how that all fits together?
Yeah, each one of those little tiny lines is 1 foot change in elevation. So I forget exactly what the total uh, elevation change is, but suffice to say, it's steep enough that it's difficult to walk up. And because the community was designed for seniors, we wanted to make sure that within the housing unit area, that that is that a senior could walk to any unit comfortably, and that we are planning to have some uh, little a little more adventurous trails up and into the oaks, so people could take advantage of that.
Yep.
But in order to make it accessible and walkable, um, it required a lot of grading, and then we had to introduce a lot of retaining walls in order to be able to move into the hillside, and that balance of how tall a retaining wall should be, because they're expensive. So you want to make sure that you're not killing your budget by having extremely large, tall walls. Plus, they're not very nice to live next to. So we wanted to make sure we had a balance of retained structures, units at different elevations to take advantage of the terrain, but then also remain walkable. We had a drainage course that ran through the middle of the property, which wasn't biologically significant, but as a feature, we wanted to make sure we maintained it. So the landscape architect that was hired kept some portions of that drainage course natural, and we're also using it as a bioretention area to capture some of the road and roof runoff. Because in California, we have to filter and clean runoff from a site before it goes into local streams, so we don't introduce any pollutants into there. So we have bioretention areas along the creeks, along the sides of the road, um, so that we can do that cleaning and filtration. We
Yeah.
also wanted to make sure that Cloverdale is a part of Northern California. It gets pretty warm in the summer. They have several days in excess of 100 to 110 degrees. So I wanted to make sure that we had a lot of tree canopy for the residents, so they don't feel like they have to be inside their home with their air conditioning on. They can go outside and work around. So we have a lot of tree cover to help reduce some of the heat, that reflected heat from the asphalt. This is what is that one? Is that the tree mitigation
Yeah.
plan?
Yeah, this is the demo plan of the trees to be removed. And I thought this was just interesting, just to kind of show the context the contours of the site, the elevations, you see those lines, those tight lines really close where it gets steep. So we're kind of building in that little valley there. But then this site really had nice, big, full grown, mature trees. And really an end goal was to preserve as many of those as possible too, right?
Yeah, because in this part of California, oak trees are really important, and a lot of cities have oak tree mitigation ordinances. So if you take out a mature oak tree, you're required to either pay or replace that tree with a number of smaller trees. So we wanted to we wanted to make sure that we removed as few trees as possible, and because we were cutting into the hillside, that's why we used a lot of retaining walls, so we didn't have to cut up into the hillside too much.
Yep.
And we were really successful in being able to remove as few trees as necessary. And then along the streets, we have a lot of public streets and private streets, so we used a number of native plant materials in those locations to help with our oak tree mitigation.
Yeah. So, Bruce, let me ask another question because we talked about it to start the conversation that this property, before the annexation process was ultimately completed, this was county and not within the city's jurisdiction of the city of Cloverdale. But everyone sort of knew from the onset, with the density that was ultimately going to go there, that we would have to connect into the city sewer system. So, how did you guys, as a civil design firm, start thinking about the applicable rules? Did you say, we're going to just look at it from the county level, or did you say, hey, we're going to immediately start applying the city of Cloverdale's expectations? How did that coordination piece start to play out?
Yeah, we always look at who's going to be ultimately responsible for providing that service, and it's the city of Cloverdale. So they had in their general plan years before identified South Cloverdale as a portion of the county that they wanted to annex. And with regard to sewer, they knew that they needed to provide sewer lines south of the existing city boundary, and they had identified the potential for a sewer lift station, a pumping station, in or around this site. So they had done some preliminary sewer capacity studies. So early on in our process, we worked with the city's consultant to make sure that they included our site in their in their update of their capacity studies, so we knew how large a pumping station we needed to put in. And so that was part of one of the things that drove the annexation. Was Dry Creek agreed to pay the upfront capital cost to put in the sewer lift station and the increased size of the water mains to handle the surrounding properties. And at some point in time, there's a reimbursement agreement that the city is working with Dry Creek on. And as future properties develop, they will contribute back to the city, and the tribe will be reimbursed for those out-of-pocket expenses. And they also got credited for their portion of those expenses that would be put in. So it was, if they didn't do it, it was going to be really difficult, because a lot of smaller property owners, their individual projects may not have had the wherewithal to be able to put in a lift station, because they're a few $100,000 on top of what you would normally have to do for your development. So
Right. And so like
that was
some of the
important.
surrounding property owners were like single family, detached, no one with necessarily short-term plans for denser development like this, right?
No, the only other property that's going to do something with potentially with a higher level of use was the Cloverdale Unified School District bought a site as a potential new high school site, and that's immediately across Kelly Road from where the project site is. But they're so far down the road, and it's a school district, so until they raised the funds to build the school, they wouldn't have monies to put in a lift station and run water mains, etc. So, so they were very anxious and eager to join in the annexation with Dry Creek.
Yeah. So ultimately, again, we're not going to spend a ton of time on the design features of the units directly, but Travoy Design was involved as the architect of record for the project for the vertical construction, kind of working alongside the LACO team. So the project kind of evolved to be a series of detached units, again, with the intent to serve elder populations that might be generational, multi-generational in nature. This is just an elevation of one of those unit types. There's a series of them that kind of fit on the site together, but really just a pretty awesome design and something that Dry Creek is going to be proud of to have as an asset for their community for many, many years to come, and that's going to provide good, stable, quality housing for elders and their grandkids and family members as needed right in Cloverdale. Just to give the participants a quick glance here. So this is a mix of 25 total units on the site. There's a mix of both 2 and 3 bedroom types. And one of the things I think we tried to do on the design side was really integrate in some elements to make it so that it wasn't just, a repeat of the exact same unit. So even just changing the roof lines on some of those units gives that flexibility to like make the community feel completely different, without just repeat of the exact same home. Even though ultimately a lot of the footprints and the floor plans of these units were very close to being the same. Bruce mentioned that a central component of this project is a 2,900 square foot, almost 3,000 square foot community amenity, to be available for residents of the project and future development. And so they'll be able to have gatherings there and use the commercial kitchen, use the outdoor amenity space. All of that in this case was financed and included as part of the assumptions as part of the original tax credit request that went into the tax credit allocating agency of California. Bruce, before we go any further, I think it could be worth real quick just talking about kind of the overall timeline, and maybe we're going to dig a little bit more into that annexation, but I think for the group's understanding how long that approvals process ultimately took, start to finish, and your role in that and working alongside Dry Creek. I'd like to hear more about that and just what ultimately that looked like.
Yeah, anytime you do fee land development in California, especially if there's an annexation involved, it adds additional time. And I don't want to encourage people or discourage people from buying fee land to do projects, but um, the project was initially envisioned, I think, 5 years ago.
Yeah.
But once it finally got traction and started moving forward, we submitted our development preliminary applications in 2020, and then, or is it 2020, 2021, having initial conversations. And then in earnest, our development application was submitted last year and went through the city process. And and once it was approved by the city, we took the annexation application to the county, the local area formation corporation, LAFCO, and got that approved. So by September, from say January, February of 2022 to September, we got the city and county approvals to move forward. And we're now at a point where the project has been out to bid and had to be rebid because, as Adam mentioned, costs in coastal California are extremely high, and a lot of value engineering had to be done after the first set of bids came in, millions of dollars higher than were anticipated. So the architecture team at Travoy, LACO's design team, and the tribe made concessions and worked with the contractor to bring costs down. So now the contract's been signed and grading permits have been pulled, and the general contractor is looking forward to starting site work within the next few weeks, and with hopes of having the units completed by late 2024.
Yep. So that sort of really lays the context for a lot of the moving parts that became part of this multi-year process, where you guys were intimately involved and working alongside the Dry Creek team. But I want to kind of hear from you. Number one, when did you specifically and when did LACO get involved? When did the tribe come to you and say, "Hey, we recognize this is a need. We need you on our team now at this point"? When was that in the process, and how early were you involved in starting those annexation discussions?
Because LACO has a planning team, we were brought in initially, civil engineering and planning. We were brought in 2018, 2019, and we started putting together the environmental documents for the NEPA study that was required. And then because it's fee land, it also required a California Environmental Quality Act study to be able to get through the city process. So the city had hired, because they don't have a robust planning department, they hired a private consultant to review the documents that we prepared. So we prepared the CEQA and NEPA documentation for that, contracted all the special studies, and the tribe had already had some studies done, geotechnical, etc. So we compiled all that information and then also started our community outreach with the residents of Cloverdale, the school district, other property owners to see who would want to join in on the annexation. So all that preliminary work happened over the first couple of years, and then there was a meeting with the city council. I believe it was in either late 2019 or early 2020, where they got a preliminary sign off from the council that they were accepting, that they would accept the annexation and approve um, the uh, the project. So then we set about preparing all the documentation, all the plans, etc., to submit to the city for a full development application. And that, as I mentioned, went in I think our first applications went in 2021, and then by 2022 we had received sufficient approvals that we could start working on our construction drawings, and those were submitted. It was kind of weird. We wanted to fast track it so that we could, as soon as we got the city council approval, we could then um, get the construction drawings approved very shortly after, instead of waiting until council approved it to start working on the construction drawings. We did them concurrently.
Yep.
So that's why we were able to pull building permits before the end of 2022, which
Yep.
was part of the tax credit requirement.
Yep. And I think lesson learned there, or just for the benefit of the participants, is that the huge advantage this provided Dry Creek was by involving LACO on the team, involving Travoy early in that process, we were all able to collaboratively work together to overcome those different challenges kind of as they arose, kind of in real time. So it was not trying to catch one of the team members up on everything that had transpired. Everyone was sort of at the table, knew what was going on with the different challenges, and those were not atypical of the process. Those were just kind of normal to a development process where, things come up and we just have to work to move forward to address them and figure out what's going to be in everyone's interest to do that. So,
That's an important point, Adam, because of Travoy's experience with low-income housing tax credits and having a robust architectural design team and understanding affordable housing finance. Um, Most tribal communities aren't experienced developers, so to be able to have that experience in your house really helps, because if a tribe has to hire a developer to work with them, and then they hire an architect who may or may not be familiar with the idiosyncrasies of low-income housing tax credits. And then if they have to hire a financial consultant to be able to work with them on the tax credit application, um, there's a time lag, and then there's potential for information to fall through the cracks, and it makes the project less nimble.
Yep.
And I found that working, because I've been involved in affordable housing for a long time, I found it really helpful. Um, and it was beneficial to the tribe to have Travoy on board, because as issues came up that looked like they would stall the project, we were able to come up with creative solutions to keep things moving forward.
Yep. No, appreciate that. So I want to throw this question out to you. And again, like I want to kind of frame this question as like, if you're a project manager at a tribe or you're the development manager and you're not necessarily looking to engage anyone yet for the civil team, but there's a couple sites that are under discussion, what's like one of the very first things, kind of low hanging fruit, that a project team member, development manager should be asking or thinking about or starting to dig into, kind of right off the bat? Like an easy one that you would say, this kind of going down this rabbit hole of asking some more questions about a particular property. What's one of those things that could be very easy for a tribal development manager to make some phone calls and start trying to do some due diligence on?
Well, the easy things are the natural hazards. Our first thing is, how accessible is the site? Can you drive to it, walk to it? Is there infrastructure close or nearby, sewer, water, storm drain, etc.? And then, depending on what you want to do with the property, whether it's for housing or for economic development, um, what kind of requirements do those uses have? Especially if it's housing, is there a school close by, a bus stop? Um, it,
Now I'm going to
it,
stop you right there, Bruce. So like just backing up a half a step, how would you actually go about finding that out? Let's say it is fee land and you know that the jurisdiction of the tribe is going to overlap with the jurisdiction of like the local city. What's the call that you make to start figuring out what is or isn't permitted?
if it's in the city, the first thing I do is I go to depending on how familiar you are with zoning ordinances and land use ordinances. um, if you are familiar, that's first place I go. Is I go to the city's website and look up their zoning ordinance, look at the zoning map and see what the site's zoned, um, what look in the general plan and see if there's something that the city wanted to be able to do with that, either with that site or with that area, and then look at the surrounding zoning and land use to see if there's anything with those adjacent sites that would conflict with what you're proposing. Because the last thing you want to do is buy a site that is just going to be contentious from the get-go. And then in California, they recently passed a number of laws to make it easier to do affordable housing. And so, like in California, we have the California Environmental Quality Act. If you're doing affordable housing, you now are exempt from needing to meet those requirements. So that means you don't have to go to the planning commission. You don't have to go to the city council for approval. You can short circuit um, a lot of that time. So several lengthy and costly hearings don't have to occur. You still have to meet the zoning requirements, but you don't have to have that discretionary approval. And yeah, Google is there is so much information available online that it makes it really helpful. And if you have a GIS person on your team that can help you dig deeper to get more information, that's helpful. Or hire a planning consultant if you don't have the in-house expertise to be able to do that. That's the first pass: is, are there any regulatory um, issues that you need to take care of, and then it's on the ground looking at the site. Had it
Yep.
previously been used for purposes that might indicate there's hazardous materials, um, like I had mentioned before, in California, we have wildfires, we have earthquakes. That's where you can go online and find how close you are to active earthquake faults. Is it in a flood zone? Go to FEMA's website and look at the flood maps and see if you're in a floodway or at risk of a 100-year flood. So there's a lot of those natural disaster type things that there are sites set up in most states to be able to quickly identify that kind of information.
Yep. So real quick, Bruce, I do think we have a couple questions. Crystal, do you want to go ahead and read those?
Absolutely. So Josh Demmett inquired, can you guide me in the right direction for attaining other funding that can help with this project, building an apartment complex and everything that comes with it? What are some other resources should I be tapping into? I also just provided your email address, just also to make things a little easier, but there you go. There's the first question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And then I at the end here in the PDF that is available for download, at the very end on the last slide, there's a slide with both Bruce and I's contact information, both my cell phone and my email, along with Bruce's as well. So feel free to just shoot me an email with that, and maybe we can have a separate side conversation about like what you're trying to do, what kind of project you're talking about, location, that type of stuff, and I can definitely help from there. Was there a second question as well, Crystal?
There was. Leroy Adams mentioned, would this also apply to projects that involve erecting 150 to 200 new housing units?
Yeah. So, this particular resource and the scale that we're talking about for the project today it's a 25 unit project. Now, what we've seen lots of clients do, Blackfeet is one of those that immediately comes to mind where they've done 7 different tax credit projects. Tohono O'odham in Arizona is another good example, Pasquiyaki, where they're kind of thinking about a larger effort like that, maybe 100 units or 150 units over a next 10-year period. How do we do those in kind of manageable chunks that are kind of proportional to the scale and capacity of the housing authority and to the contractor as well? So this might be a big project in itself to do 30 units, but to think of the funding and the resources for a 100-unit project, if you can start to break that up in more manageable chunks, what you could potentially do is, do a first phase as a tax credit project. Maybe it's a second phase with some other funding resource that you've identified for middle income housing. Maybe there's a competitive IHBG that helps fund a portion of the project. So starting to break it up into more manageable, kind of smaller chunks, I think that's a good way to do it. Bruce, do you have anything to add to that? Just as far as like an end goal might be 150 units, but how do we get there in more incremental steps?
Yeah, and a lot of it's going to have to do too with your local state uh, tax credit housing or low income housing tax credit um, authorizing entity,
Yeah.
because depending on whether they have a tribal set aside or not. California has a set aside, and I think it's like 1.5 million now per year for tribal projects. Um, and it's hard for tribal projects typically to compete with some of the more urban ones because of the points you get for amenities like schools and shopping and bus transportation and health clinics.
Mm-hmm.
And unless your state has set up some special rules with regard to tribal communities, you don't want to propose a development that's too large, um, because there may not be enough tax credits to support that. So yeah, multi-phase tax credit projects make total sense, and it's a lot easier to lease up because your property management team doesn't have to process 100 or 200 uh, or hundreds of applications to be able to get 100 or 200 qualified tenants. Um, so I have worked on a number of tax credit projects where you have a low-income housing tax credit project that's 50 to 75 units, and then you have either a moderate income or even market rate. We've partnered I with organizations I work with. We've partnered with other for-profit developers to do market rate rental developments. So that enables the residents of the low-income units to take advantage of some of the site amenities
Mhm.
that a market rate developer would want to install. Naturally, that's more than likely going to be a fee project. I don't know that on trust property if a market rate developer can or would be able to do a development there, but
Yeah.
that would be a Travoy question.
Yeah. Um, I think another thing that comes to mind in that discussion, Bruce, is that the huge advantage it gives to appropriately sizing and planning for infrastructure. So if a tribe's end goal is, say, 150 units over the next 5 to 10 years, knowing upfront like how to plan for and what that infrastructure is going to need to look like accordingly, so that maybe the infrastructure goes in with each of those successive phases. But if we're starting off with just 20 units without looking further down the road that ultimately there's going to be 4 more phases of that exact same project, it's to everyone's advantage to think about that infrastructure need long term up front, right?
Yeah, you want to upsize your water lines and sewer lines. The other thing that the drought in the western U.S. has brought up is the availability of water. There are some communities that want to grow, theoretically need to grow, but they don't have the water resource to be able to provide water hookups to those units. So that's another thing that needs to be considered is, you may have there may be wells on site, or you have the ability to hook up to municipal water, but you know how much capacity do they really have in the near term and long term? So we're getting really really good at water efficient water use, but these last 10 years of dry weather in the West are not the end. We have had some intense rains on the West Coast, but we're still in a drought condition and will be for several years. So uh, water is going to be really important, and as you size the size of a multi-phase development, you want to make sure you don't plan on being able to do phase 3 or 4 and then find out that there's not enough water to be able to do hookups. So
Absolutely. Yep.
thinking development is a chess game. You're always thinking 2 or 3 moves ahead, because you don't want to be caught unaware.
Because that's a risk, right? I mean, that's a risk that we're talking about trying to mitigate now, thinking about what that risk is going to be in the future. And the risk you're talking about is water availability.
Yeah, tribal environmental knowledge, that's it's a big thing. People that have lived on the land in one place for thousands of years know a lot more about it than somebody that's a
Absolutely.
Johnny come lately.
Yep.
And I've seen more and more governmental entities, and I think you all have as well. They're understanding that and valuing that. And when a tribe can come to a municipality, if they're buying fee land, and say, this is what we're proposing, and this is, and just show them that you are thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead, and that this is not just for the benefit of our X number of units on our project, but we're looking to benefit the community in general, and show them what other benefits to the community your development would have, like Dry Creek, with putting in the sewer and water infrastructure for surrounding properties, and being able to step up and say, yeah, we'll cover the cost of that, and then we'll get reimbursed in the future because we know that growth is going to occur.
Yep. You're right.
So
So I want to go back to like this practical, like, if you're a project manager or you're a development director at a tribe, like getting something off the ground and what you could do as a really cheap resource. One of those that I found very, very helpful is this resource called SketchUp. So it's a Google program that sort of is like Google Earth, but it allows you to do some like kind of preliminary modeling. So like if someone likes to mess around with, kind of computer modeling and computer software, this is a great resource. It's free. But one of the things that's cool about it is that you can simply, like, on your computer, pull up Google Maps and pull up the scale down at the bottom and take a screenshot of, like, maybe the parcel that you're talking about. And what you can do is you can place that image, again, just kind of real rough. This isn't like a super technical thing, but you can stretch that image out to scale in this 3D environment, where then you can start kind of putting onto the site, like, building footprints. Maybe it's you want to see what a 30 by 30 looks like on the site. So it starts to give some real visual cues of maybe what's possible. But the other thing that I've seen, I forget where I was, maybe it was the Pueblo of Acoma where I saw this and just thought it was a brilliant idea. It was a massive sheet of paper. It was like a big piece of, like a tablecloth, that size of paper rolled out in a big roll. And they had cut off about a 10-foot length and then made two sections and just stacked them on top of each other on the wall. And then they literally had a hand drawing of the site. And on that site, they started writing down all of the risks that became, so they just would write it down in the margin. And then they would start drawing, utility line information that they got from the utility company. And so had a conversation about information that they received about fire hydrant location. And they would literally just draw it on the wall on this big giant sheet of paper. But it gave everyone in the room the ability to say, oh, so-and-so talked to so-and-so, and they talked, so it started this running list, and it became this database, basically this visual database of the site. And I thought what was really interesting about it was, like, we all do this and we're having conversations all the time, but how easy it is for information to get lost in the process. And all they were doing was systematically writing it down and then making a little drawing that they then could communicate to their team as the team came on board. So they went to their civil and they went to their architect and they said, hey, here's all the information we've gathered. We know the utility providers. We know where the easements are. We had a conversation with the roads department and the land department, and they were able to tell us that there's a power line that runs through the middle of the property. And so all of that information became sort of the baseline for the professionals to start their work and say, kind of either verify it or say, oh, that's slightly a misinterpretation of the information. We could do this a slightly different way. But that huge kind of mock-up on the wall with handwritten, notes and notations became extremely, extremely valuable because it gave everyone a centralized location to start identifying what risks and people would have conversations and they would say, oh, I heard that a while back, we had to do some environmental work because the property adjacent used to be an old dump. So then they would start digging into that more, and they would just make a note of all these different risks for the property. And it became this priceless tool for them to get this thing off the ground and start communicating with each other.
Yeah, and that's really important. When I was in college, I studied landscape architecture, and site analysis was an important part of the early stages of doing a project and developing that opportunities and constraints map, because it's a graphic visual thing. But as a developer over time, myself, I do those kind of opportunities and constraint maps for any project I work on. And as you said, anytime you do a study or a report, you have all this information coming in, and it's rare to be able to consolidate that kind of information in one place so people can understand it. Usually they're cloistered away in separate
Yeah.
studies and reports. So yeah, that something like that, and that's where geographic information systems are really important. If you have the ability to do that, you can take all of that type of graphic information, put them on individual layers, and overlay them over a site plan to be able to see, what can and can't be done in different locations.
Yep. So one of the other resources kind of up front that I certainly think is worth the money in most instances is an Alta survey. And so an Alta survey, Bruce, that's sort of like the top of the line, the gold standard of survey work. And the idea there is that you can tell your surveyor up front, I want you to help me identify all of these different things that could be applicable at the property. That could be setbacks, it could be elevations, it could be zoning, it could be wetlands. But what it does is it starts to map out in actual, like, on the ground terms where everything is on the property. This is a Alta survey of a totally unrelated property, but I think it was a good example. So this middle line that cuts through the property on this particular property, this is a utility easement for overhead power lines. Or actually, I think it was a drainage easement. So what it was, this information was probably a $10,000 or $15,000 survey. So investment that was well worth it in the long run, because it really starts to give the project team, including the developer, the tribal housing authority of the tribe, information about all of those kind of risk points and exactly where they are on the site. So here you can see that there's an old building foundation. Maybe everyone knew about that, but maybe it slipped off the radar and everyone kind of forgot about it. So we can now say, okay, how do we address that? How do we get that foundation? Do we have our own crew just go out there? Can they jackhammer it up? Or do we have to put that into the scope of work for the contractor? How's that going to fit in? But the other critical thing is it really enabled them to start thinking about, okay, if we have to avoid this drainage ditch completely, even in just a conceptual kind of back of the napkin layout and kind of iterations that the housing team was doing on their own, again, even before an architect or an engineer was engaged, they could come up with a few little renderings to better communicate with council and say, hey, like, do you like this concept? Or, if we put some units over here to avoid this drainage ditch, what's your thought on that? So this is like a next step that I see that's worthwhile to pay for, to have that professional survey work done, to really start to drill down on what the site contains. And then it's going to lead to an opportunity to start asking a whole other set of questions. Is that fair?
Yeah, one of the important things too, when you talked about that foundation, I worked on a park project, and the site had previously, years and years before, had an elementary school. And when we were doing our geotechnical work, when they were doing the borings to determine what this underlying soils look like, I told them, I said, there used to be a school here. I don't know if the old foundations had been removed or just filled in. And if you're going to be building structures, you want to make sure you know what's below the ground, because you don't want your new building to settle crooked. Or once you get into construction and your site work contractors out there with equipment and they start moving dirt and then they find these concrete structures, they're going to charge you extra to remove them.
Yep.
And if there's potential for underground storage tanks, then that introduces a whole nother set of issues. So yeah, having a good survey done, having the title company do searches for easements, all the things that Adam mentioned, you just want to know as much about that site as possible and look back at historic documents. That's where that phase one environmental site assessment comes in, because it'll look back in history to see how the site had previously been used. And if there's documentation of structures, what they were used for, then you can focus your on-site investigations to make sure that there were no spills, no underground or above ground storage tanks, et cetera, et cetera. So you can be proactive versus reactive, because anytime you're in a reactive situation in construction, it's really expensive.
Yep. And so the more that you know about those things that you're going to have to deal with, the more that you can plan accordingly. And then it comes as less of a surprise, right? I mean, so ideally, even if the costs end up high, it's easier to kind of plan for that at the front end and say, hey, council, we've identified all the possible risks. It's going to cost this much, but if you can do that and minimize changes during construction, that's probably to everyone's advantage.
Exactly.
I think I have a special guest feature here from Ron Swanson for everyone. I have a permit. I can do what I want. I thought Bruce, you'd appreciate that.
Yeah, we get once you get any kind of an approval from a local jurisdiction, you get really excited. You go, okay, nothing can stop us now. And then you submit your plans to be reviewed, and they come back with comments that you respond to, and then you resubmit your drawings, and then there's a whole new set of comments. You say, well, why didn't you pick this up last time? Oh, well, we can't pick everything up, and so you make the changes and resubmit, and then you pull your building permits, you're on site and you're doing work, and then the building inspector comes out and says, oh, oh, by the way, you need to do this. It's like, well, why didn't you pick that out on one of the two or three plan check reviews? Well, we can't review everything. So we always talked about those, oh, by the way. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, and you just hear the
Yeah.
cash register going off in your head. It's like,
Yep.
really? You want us to do that now after
Yep.
we've bid this out? And yeah.
Absolutely. So I think another one that's a pretty easy, low hanging fruit one that a project manager could be looking at is understanding the utilities at the site. So at a minimum, understanding and getting a list of contacts of who those providers are, but maybe just starting to kind of map out on the back of an envelope again, just with a little drawing, like where those utilities run, if there's easements, again, maybe that's talking to the land office. Maybe it's talking to the planning office, but trying to get a sense of, where is power coming in from the site? Is there a transformer at the corner of the site that, we could mark with a red X on a map and say, hey, this, I've already done some digging on this. Here's where it's at. I've talked to the power company and they think that we could connect into it. I gave them a rough idea that we're talking about 30 units. What other ideas related to utility identification come to mind that could be helpful in this preliminary phase?
You never want to get in a situation where you're saying, okay, whatever that is, sewer, water, electrical, oh, that'll do. It'll suffice. Because if down the road, if that needs to be upsized or needs to be improved, if it's an old water line that may fail, whatever, you want to make sure you're asking the questions, okay, will this handle my capacity plus additional? Because water lines, sewer lines, when they're brand new, they can handle a lot of, X number of gallons or whatever. But as they age, they get clogged up, they rust, they get build up, and they're able to handle less. So the last thing you want is to have your property have insufficient water pressure, especially for fire suppression. You don't want your sanitary sewer to not be able to flow and have things backing up. You don't want your stormwater system to be overwhelmed and have your project flood. Um, the note that you have on there about renewable energy strategies, that's extremely important because we already know that electrical power in our country isn't as reliable as it once was. The demands on it are just increasing, and if you can take energy into your own hands with rooftop solar on the buildings and carports, and maybe some other freestanding photovoltaic panel arrays with battery backup, you're going to be able to harden your infrastructure so that you can weather those, whatever storm comes through and knocks out your power grid for whether days or weeks.
Yep.
Um, Especially if you have a vulnerable population like elders or people that are requiring, medical devices, for their safety. Um, and then that utility coordination and timeline in California, after our fires and things, Pacific Gas and Electric, our major utility, they got sued. They've had to file for bankruptcy. What once was, you file your plans for development with PG&E, they review it, and then at X date they come out and they make the connections and turn your power and gas on. um, you can't rely on that anymore. They're holding up the start of projects by some weeks or sometimes months because they're just overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
So understanding your particular utility company and what their shortcomings might be. Um, and things like if you're in the Southeast or in the Midwest and it's tornado season or hurricane season and you're going to be into construction, you have to anticipate if there's a major event, the cost of sheet goods, of plywood and oriented strand board and things like that, they're either not going to be available or the prices are going to go through the roof. So you got to think beyond the property line of your project and look at how many other factors can influence your timing of construction and your cost.
Yeah. I think that goes to the point that you mentioned before, that a huge advantage of this exercise is that if you're thinking about this in the context of not just the 25 units to be built this year, but if there's been any discussion at all that, hey, this is a site for future development, and thinking about how all of those things are going to impact not only this particular project, but that future development as well, that's really where a tribe can be best served, tribal housing authority. Because if there is a chance, even if it's 5 years down the road, or maybe even 10 years down the road, but if more homes are going to go at that site, then it's much cheaper and much more effective, efficient to be able to deal with that now versus having to try to upsize the lines or increase the capacity at a later date, right?
Absolutely. You don't want to paint yourself into a corner that's going to cost you more money down the road. Because if you put in a pipe that's so many inches, and then you decide down the road you want to do a development that's upstream of where you're at, and it's like, okay, now we can't do that because we don't have the capacity in the infrastructure we installed. So if we want to do that, we have to upsize all these pipes
Yep.
or whatever. So if you develop more than what you're going to need with the expectation that you're going to need it or someone's going to need it down the road, that's always a good thing to do. Because you know a piece of pipe, yeah, the trenching and installation is expensive, but for changing pipe size from one size to the next size up or whatever isn't as expensive as having to rip it out and reinstall down the road.
Sure.
So
Yep. So, kind of getting back to that, like practical on the ground question that a project developer, project manager could be asking: how do you go about trying to think about what the sewer water capacity is? I hear that talked about all the time, how important it is, but like, who do you call? What's the question that you ask to start, kind of digging into that more?
yeah, once you have your engineering team, your engineer established or someone picked, and you tell them we want to do X number of units, they're 1, 2, or 3 bedroom, they'll be able to tell how much water it's going to need, how much sewer it's going to generate. They'll be able to look at whatever documentation the city or county has for the sewer and water infrastructure in that vicinity and say, well, you've got this large of a sewer line, you got this large of a water line, and the cities, most cities will have that kind of information on how much capacity or what the water pressure is at a certain point, and then they can do those calculations. In California, those are required um, studies to do when you submit a development application. So engineers here typically that's what they'll do at the very in the early stages of a development, is to look at the sewer water capacity, storm drain as well, and then and when you talk with your mechanical, electrical, and plumbing engineer, you'll have them do the same thing for electrical to make sure that whatever infrastructure is in the vicinity, it could handle the additional power demands of your project. Because if you have to, if they have to upsize, you want to make sure you get that into their queue as early as possible, because depending on that agency, it may take them a while to do that, and you don't want to get held up by not being able to have enough electricity. We have a
Right.
project we're working on in Northern California. It's an expansion of an existing hospital, a renovation of an existing hospital. And Pacific Gas and Electric said, we can't do it. We can't provide additional power for that hospital expansion. In fact, in this region, in this particular area, we're not allowing any new we can't hook up any new development because we don't have the power infrastructure to provide electricity. And that was the first time we'd ever heard of that happening, in this part of the state.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So totally going to derail the entire project potentially,
yep,
right? Yep.
yeah, put everything comes to a screeching halt.
So, and that kind of goes back to this idea that, a tribe might not even need a formal like master plan, a 5-year strategy plan, but they at least should be able to tell you, or it would be helpful to communicate to you as a civil, like, okay, we're talking about 25 units here. However, a little bit longer term, we do envision that more housing could go here and that could make sense. Or, maybe this is adjacent to our existing casino, and we're kind of setting aside this parcel area for economic development or commercial development, but we realize like right next to that could be very viable opportunity for a new school that we've been talking about. Again, like those even just kind of super preliminary, like we don't have to talk about specifics yet, but that idea alone is going to give you some foresight to say, okay, yeah, this makes sense. Let's size the infrastructure for potentially going down that path, even if it's to be determined on what that looks like.
Taking a step back from that, we're working with a few tribes and talking with others about starting um, comprehensive sustainable master plans for their tribal lands, being able to take a look at and work with the tribe on visioning what they see for the future of their tribal lands, whether it's housing, economic development, recreation, cultural resources, and then being able to help them develop a master plan so that then we can start examining all of those utilities and the infrastructure. It just do a thorough examination of their lands so that they know going forward that over the next 5, 10, or 20 years, they're going to be able to do these things on their lands. And these are the improvements that will need to be made, or that would need to be taken into consideration to be able to do that kind of growth.
Yep.
So, yeah,
So I think
that's
that's a
really
great
important.
segue into kind of this preliminary engineering evaluation idea. So like paying someone like Laco kind of up front, um, what would that look like? You hit on a bunch of those where you would kind of help formally evaluate the capacity of those things and try to put those things in place to say, hey, here's what would need to happen for X development to occur. This is something that, again, is not extremely expensive in the big picture of things, but is extremely, extremely valuable in the intel that it's going to provide as far as planning perspective and communicating with council and communicating with the other departments. Is there anything else that you would kind of recommend or think about as far as paying for some type of preliminary engineering evaluation to help evaluate a site?
We're working with a few tribes right now that even in advance of doing this preliminary engineering evaluation, we're working with them on trying to pull in funding to do these studies. So we're looking at helping them get grant funding, whether it's from state, federal, or even local sources, and then to be able to do the pre-development work that this preliminary engineering evaluation would be, and then looking at funding to be able to do the entitlement processing if necessary, and the production of the construction drawings. So, not only do we do the work and some of the special studies, the survey, some of the environmental studies with our geotechnical team, but our we're always looking at trying to help our clients figure out how to pay for things. One of the things that we're working on with one of the tribes as we're doing their master plan, one of the elements of it is to develop capital improvement plans for different infrastructure improvements that they know they're going to need. So in addition to doing the preliminary and conceptual infrastructure plans, we're also putting a financing plan together to help them see what sources are potentially available, and then as part of the the plan is to help them put together the grant applications to go after those funds. So we're
Not
not
only what's
completely
needed, not only what improvements are needed, but how we're going to pay for it as well.
yeah, and we're not a one-stop shop, but we try to cover as many bases as possible, because if you have all that knowledge in-house, like when Laco and Travoy worked together on the Dry Creek project, we have all this in-house knowledge about tax credits and architecture and the engineering and the financing that it just, like I said before, it just works more smoothly and we're more nimble.
Yep. I know we're coming up right on close to the end of our discussion for today. So, Crystal, I'm going to ask you again if there's any other questions in the chat. And again, encourage the participants, if there are questions, Bruce and I are both more than happy to help with those now, or feel free to reach out to us after as well. I'm going to go ahead and put our contact information on the screen. This is on the last slide. That's available for download in the lower left-hand corner as well. But again, Bruce and I are more than happy to be a resource. Reach out on my cell phone, send me an email, same for Bruce, and we're more than happy to help with just brainstorming or questions that you may be thinking about for a particular project, whether that's housing or economic development, or maybe it's a new admin facility. The same type of principles apply regardless of the project type. So all of these types of due diligence that we're talking about would be applicable for any and all of those.
Awesome. Adam, you do have 2 questions. What would a tribe do if there are water problems with the tax credit housing project years later?
Is that availability of water or quality of water? Well, either way, the investors in the tax credit project, I mean, they have a vested interest in making sure the property's safe and habitable. And there are reserves that are part of the tax credits operating budget. So depending on what the issue is, it can either be handled with reserves, or if additional funding needs to be sought for some unforeseen catastrophic event, like you're in Flint, Michigan, and the municipal
Right,
water is no
right.
longer drinkable. But yeah,
Yeah, and
Adam.
I think what I would recommend there as well, Bruce, is that I think sometimes people overlook how, like, the investor tax credit partner wants to be, cooperative and wants to be part of that problem solving process. Like, they're not out to, be, um, you know, uh, take away or like be an adversary. They're a partner. They're as invested in the project as a tribal housing authority is, or the tribal housing department. So again, it's like coming to your team of professionals, coming to Travoy, coming to Laco, incorporating in your tax credit partner from the onset in that discussion and say, hey, this is the reality of where we're at. We're all trying to brainstorm and figure out solutions to make it work. How can we work on this together? Because then it's not necessarily a surprise. It's not something that, anyone's trying to hide from anyone. It's like, how can we figure this out together and be proactive about it? And I think in that process, there's lots of opportunity for really, really good opportunities for problem solving to come up. And then, from there, it's like, okay, well, who do we have to, is this something that the state needs to be aware of or not? Or can we just figure this out and come up with a plan and tell them this is what we're going to do to get it taken care of? So again, view that investor partner as a collaborator partner and not necessarily as an adversary. They want to play that role as well.
Wonderful. And Patricia also asked, do you have a list of funding resources?
Yeah, I would say, again, just, shoot me an email about the particular type of project that you're thinking about. And, Bruce and I are, again, there's lots of different sources out there, and it sort of varies on what type of project you might be thinking about. So just shoot me an email and I'm happy to brainstorm some more ideas.
Yeah, and as far as funding goes, we don't think of funding just limited to what's available to develop the housing. It's Is there funding available for broadband or alternative
Absolutely.
energy and other infrastructure things? So we want to tie together as many things as possible anytime you do a project. Sometimes it makes them a little more complicated, but if it gives you more flexibility and freedom down the road, that's what you want to be able to do, especially if you're doing stuff on trust land and in fee land as well. Uh, whether it's energy or we're helping a tribe with a tribal lending office to be able to develop the infrastructure and so we're looking at an aquaculture project with one of the tribes to do a research and a research facility on the coast. So yeah, don't limit your thinking just to housing. There's a
Yep.
lot of funding out there, especially now, for a lot of creative things.
Yep. Crystal, any other questions?
That is all.
Well, again, I want to thank Bruce for joining me today and bringing his expertise to the table. Hopefully, this has been a helpful discussion. Again, we are more than happy to be resources as you're thinking about ideas. Reach out to us anytime. I also want to thank the Native Learning Center for the opportunity to have this important discussion and continue to be a resource across Indian country. I know the Native Learning Center does so much related to financial planning and project planning and across the board, great resource through their webinar series and their podcasts. So again, we appreciate that opportunity, and thanks again. And thank you, Bruce, for your participation today.
My pleasure.
Thank you, gentlemen. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and throw up my closing slides. And if you could take a second to fill out the survey, I'm going to go ahead and launch it. Or if you can scan that QR code, it would be greatly appreciated. Just lets us know how we can improve these sessions. And if you have any ideas for future webinars as well, feel free to throw that in there. All right, join us for our next webinar, which is going to be on January 26th, using tax credits to pay for 70 to 85% of your big housing effort, presented by Adam Rose, Director of Partnerships and Growth for Travoy. That'll be 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, 12 p.m. Mountain, 11 a.m. Pacific. And as always, registration is free. And don't forget to access this and other recorded webinars anytime on our website, www.nativelearningcenter.com. Feel free to view them and share them with your friends and colleagues. We keep them up for 18 months, so you have plenty of time to view this episode or not episode, but webinar and many others. And don't forget to check out our upcoming events as well on our social media sites such as Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And don't forget we're on Snapchat, and we also have a podcast, the Whole Book Thing Up podcast, which you can find on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, and Simplecast. And that's all for today, folks. I hope all of you have a wonderful day, and we definitely hope to connect with y'all real soon. So for now, bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.